It was wonderful, really, once again, Charles Godfrey really did manage to complement magnificently the previous talks we've had. I think particularly Dominique van Mensbrugge's talk, which is about 12 months ago now. So anyone who didn't, for instance, see Dominique's talk, you should definitely go online to the Teagasc website and catch up with it, because it really does, they complement each other magnificently in the way that Dominique presented a huge amount of the data that Charles is making passing references to sometimes. But Charles pulled an implication from a lot of the data that we didn't hear discussed on that previous occasion. So that's absolutely wonderful, and thank you again for a fantastic, really interesting talk. I'm just keeping an eye on the Twitter feed, and as I say, I'd be very keen to see comments coming while our discussion proceeds. In particular, Thomas, who tweets as Tay saves lives. I'd certainly be very interested, if Thomas is interested in making some comments from the floor later on. Please feel free to identify yourself. He's a sustainable farmer with some interesting thoughts on this whole area, so please feel free to join the conversation, which will now, as it were, begin. The format will be that I'm going to invite our two panellists to join the table now. Frank O'Mara, who's Director of Research at Teagasc, and Sean Malloy, who's Director of Strategy and Supplier Relations at Glanbia Ingredients. So in a way, we have two perfect people to offer their perspectives on what we've just heard. Frank comes from an academic background originally in UCD, but is now with Teagasc in the whole area of applied science and technology, whereas Sean comes from a strong business background, Price Waterhouse initially, if I remember rightly, and is now obviously with, I guess, one of the biggest milk processing company in Ireland, with a turnover of about 750 million euro. So it ain't small potatoes, if you'll excuse the horrible mixed metaphor there. So the format is I'm going to invite both Frank and Sean to make brief comments, if you wouldn't mind, about 5 minutes apiece, on what they've heard from their unique perspectives, and then we'll throw it open to the floor for discussion. So I think Frank, I'll call. Frank suggests. Frank has deferred to Sean Malloy. So if Sean doesn't mind, but if Sean would prefer, I'm more than happy to call Frank first.
No, it's fine.
Okay, Sean, if you wouldn't mind, a few words. As I say, if I could ask you to keep to about 5 minutes, so that we can have a discussion following that.
What are you looking at, Alice, said the Queen. Nothing, responded Alice. Nothing. What wonderful eyesight to see nothing and at such a distance. Alice in Wonderland, our speaker at the start, referred to the Red Queen, and it struck me from reading this book to the kids at home that our speaker is certainly not looking at nothing. And whatever about his eyesight, like myself, he wears the glasses, he certainly is looking at a vision of the world that's going to be very different to where we are today. And Frank invited me to make some comments here today, and the chairman asked me to be somewhat controversial and to maybe challenge what was presented. It's a very difficult challenge, the logic that was presented by the speaker. But let's have a go, and let's have a look at it from the perspective that I see in our business. I suppose the first question I wonder is, have we been here before? The speaker referred to the Malthusian crash in the 70s and the 1970s, and the worry, would the world run out of food? Would we have a greater population? Would we be able to feed the world? I'll go back a little further, Chairman. I'll go back 300 years, and I'll quote, I think it was Jonathan Swift, back in the early 1700s, and he wrote a wonderful piece. He said, "Whoever can make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass grow where before only one grew, deserves better of mankind and has done more essential service to the country than all the masses of politicians. Now, clearly, Mr. Swift held politicians in low esteem, unlike today, of course. Things have improved since the early 1700s. But the worry about feeding the world is not a new phenomenon. And I suppose from where I look at it as a company that's grown substantially, that's seen productivity across our business increase, that's developed and invested and used science and innovation to move forward, I wonder, is the concern justified to the extent perhaps presented? One of the observations I would make, I suppose, in listening to the very interesting paper, in terms of, if I look at it as a business, and if I look at the business that we're in, the production of dairy and dairy ingredients, which we sell all around the world, what are the things that concern us most in terms of growing our production, in terms of servicing the growing markets that we enter? And what are the things that concern the market into which we serve most? The most significant concern that we have is the area of volatility, the uncertainty of the environment in which we operate. If I look at it today, and one of the criticisms I would perhaps have of the paper is the lack of central role that the farmer might have in the conversation that we have here today. Our farmers today in Ireland have been limited by policymakers who one assumes were led by good science and good economics at the time the policies were put in place in terms of milk quotas. Today they're about to be removed, but what's driving the uncertainty now is the whole area of volatility. This uncertainty that if I make an investment, will that return to me? And I think as policymakers, one of the areas that we need to address when we talk about sustainability is sustainability of incomes, sustainability of return. All of the concerns that were addressed here, if we can't ensure that we have farmers on our land deriving a sustainable return from their production, then all of this will be very challenged. The other, I suppose, challenge I would make, there was a cry and a natural and a merited point at the end of your paper where you looked for more investment in research and development. I think a very credible request, and certainly for this audience here, I doubt with too many would object to that, and nor would we as a company. But the challenge I would put is to identify the real success in translating that monies that is spent on research and development into out onto farms, into companies like ourselves. How much of that, if I want to call it, has been sustainable research? How much is actually delivered versus what has actually been spent? And I think a real challenge for us, not just in Ireland, but indeed in the agricultural and food industry generally, is to try and increase the productivity and the linkage between what we spend on research and the actual return we get for that. And the other challenge I would present is the speaker rightly praised the credentials of Ireland in terms of our capability on extension, getting that information out there. But I just question that. If I look at our own industry and I look at the dairy production environment here in Ireland and the bell curve that has existed for decades in terms of efficient production and lack of efficiency in production, I think the whole area of research in that sphere is very badly needed in terms of more focus. And we're not alone in Ireland in that regard too. If we look across internationally at our competitors, this is something that's a feature. I think the emphasis on the farm and the farm unit is something that we need to place more emphasis on in order to get success. If I look at Ireland and I go back to the start of milk quotas, we had something 60, 70, 80,000 dairy farmers. Today we have a fraction of that. Hopefully beyond 2015 that will increase. But I think we have to challenge ourselves as policymakers and to look back and see what were the successes and what were the failures of policy in that regard. I think all of the science and all of the research that we have, one of the questions I would have is, has it improved the lifestyle or the return to the primary producer? Because this, in my mind, will determine the kind of individual that goes into primary production, and that will influence our capabilities in terms of a world to produce food. The other area, I suppose, maybe to draw on a success, the speaker rightly talked about some of the challenges in some of the developing nations. You mentioned India and Africa. One of the great examples that I like to give of success in this area that we can have in the dairy industry is in terms of what we're able to do with dairy product. We have a plant in Glanbia that's operating in the northern part of the country in Virginia, and there we take in milk from dairy farmers. And that milk is split into two categories. We take the cream of the milk, and that goes into the production of Bailey's cream liqueur, sold in the most expensive outlets around the world. You go to any of the great cities of the world and you'll find that product there. But the other half of that milk, the protein element, through innovation, through research and through science, we're able to land that in the poorest countries in the world and make a return for all elements within the supply chain in that regard. So I think I would place great hope on the ability of innovation and research to address some of the questions that are posed by our speakers. So, Chairman, I might leave it at that with the cry that I think we've been here before. Science has the answer, but we need to challenge ourselves in terms of how we deliver that and the success that we achieve from the investment that we make in that science. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm minded that Dr. Swift also had a modest proposal for how to feed the country. Frank, please.
Sean, if I'd known you were going to quote so eloquently Alice in Wonderland there, I wouldn't have offered you the chance to get up first, but I've nothing to trump that, I'm afraid. And I suppose Leo asked us, to challenge Charles as much as we could, to get some debate going. But I'm afraid I don't have a big long list of things to challenge Charles on. I agree with him in a lot, but maybe some of the details not quite. First thing I agree with you, I share with you, is your optimism for the future. I think we can tend to overstate the challenge and be overawed by the fact that we have 50% more people or whatever to feed over the next 50 years. We have consistently grown food production over many, many decades, and there's no reason to fear that growth in food production is suddenly going to stop. So it's a question of, can we just keep the food production matching the growth in population? So I share your optimism. There's 3 points that I wanted to make, really. The first is around the sustainable intensification and the challenge, I suppose, you put out as to what sustainable intensification is, and that it shouldn't be, I suppose, a plea bargain by farmers who want to just intensify and so on. And I tend to agree with you in that much, but I would think very much in Europe and in Ireland and the UK, I'm sure just as much, there are so many checks and balances in the system in terms of the environmental regulations and that we operate under, that there's very little fear of intensification not being sustainable here in this neck of the woods. And if it wasn't, it's not just the regulation, I guess it's also the whole retail sector is also driving demands for sustainability. So I don't think we have a particular challenge in keeping our intensification in this part of the country sustainable. In terms of technologies, I absolutely agree with you, and I suppose you'd say, why wouldn't I, that science and technology can play a huge role in the challenges that we face, or as I say, I don't want to overstate the challenge, but in the need to continue to grow food production. And, I don't think anybody here probably would disagree too much with that, but science has been responsible for most of the gains that we have made in food production over the last 100 years or longer, and that will continue if we want to make further gains in food production. There will be a requirement to invest in science and technology. Sean challenged us a little bit, in terms of it's not just a question of putting money into the system, and I suppose I'm speaking on a day as well when the Department of Agriculture here just announced funding of, I think, 26 million in agriculture and food research. So we're at we are, I suppose, in a situation here in Ireland where the investment in research and in agriculture and food research has continued fairly strongly despite our economic travails. But I think that the challenge is to get the deliverables back out of the system. And I think we're up to that challenge. I think here in Ireland, we've always had a strong focus because we're not a huge country. We have to focus on getting impact from our work. And I'd say we're as good as any and better than most in terms of the value that we deliver back from the investment in science and technology in this country. And there have been studies done that have shown a huge payoff from science and technology here. But you can't rest on your laurels, and the goalposts move. We're constantly asked to deliver more, and that's only right. And we had earlier on today, we had Professor Mark Ferguson, the Director General of Science Foundation Ireland, here at our earlier seminar, and he emphasised the need for impact from research. We obviously need excellent research, whether it's applied or basic research, it needs to be excellent, but we need impact from that. And I think that demand which Sean articulated, is very much in evidence in the research funding system here in Ireland, and it's also very much in evidence at a European level in the new Horizon 2020 programme that's due to be launched in the next couple of weeks. So I think you're right to challenge us, but I think we have been, and we will continue, and we will improve the way we deliver in terms of the impact from science. I was struck with the priorities that Charles put up. They were very much along the lines, I suppose, of the three that I would prioritise myself in terms of food production, just sticking at that rather than at the processing end. But the whole agronomy side, I think you rightly said we have to try to excite people as much about the soil science and the crop agronomy and the animal husbandry as much as the biotechs. Genetics and breeding is obviously a key technology for us, whether it's plant breeding or animal breeding. And, I don't want to get into a technical, I suppose, discussion, but you made a point that kind of didn't resonate with me in terms of not selecting for traits that nature would select for in any case, because you're probably right in a sense, and you mentioned, the fitness traits. But if you take something like fertility, and obviously for animals, the ability to reproduce is probably the primary trait that you would think nature would select for. We have managed through our interference in animal breeding to decrease the fitness of our bovine population in terms of that very important trait. So we've got to watch what we do in breeding, and we can reverse things like that. But it's just a small point maybe. And the third technology would be precision agriculture or big data or whatever we want to call it. But I think that's going to probably be the thing when we look back in 20 years' time. That will be the thing we'll say that really delivered in terms of growth and productivity gains for both animal and crop-based agriculture. So the last point I wanted to make then was around the whole knowledge transfer and deployment and uptake of technology. And I've kind of touched on it, but I just wanted to emphasise, I suppose, there's no point having a very strong science system if that operates in isolation from your stakeholders and from the industry who might use it. So it is really critical to have a strong knowledge transfer service, and not just, a knowledge transfer type of extension service, but also a strong education service. And that goes right through all the strands of education of relevance to this topic here, from agricultural education for farmers and farm workers and managers, right through to the education of graduates who are going to enter the agri-food business or enter into research. It's really essential that we continue to invest in education and in extension as well as in research. So I'll leave it at that, Chairman, and sorry for maybe not being more provocative, but I really enjoyed the lecture, and it's hard to find fault with something that I thought was very good.
Thanks very much indeed, Frank. And I think certainly looking at the Twitter comments that we're getting so far, a lot of people do seem to have picked up on the broad theme of Professor Godfrey's presentation. We got a tweet from Jesus Colmena-Ero, who's an agronomist in Madrid. I don't know if he's present or whether he's tweeting from Madrid. But he just is making the point, as our other speakers have made, makes it very succinctly: whatever we care about, if we fail on food, we fail on everything, which I think is just about sums up the tone of the discussion. So, Charles Godfrey, I think just before I open the discussion to the floor, I thought I'd give you a chance to respond to our two panellists just before we move into a general discussion. Do you have any thoughts?
Very briefly, first to thank Sean and Frank for a really interesting response. And with some interesting nuances there, but beyond the nuances, and I'll comment on a couple in a second, I think an interesting thing is the sort of commonality of views that we all have. So we might disagree about details, but not about the major things. Two things I'd just like to bring up from Sean. So Sean talked about, well, haven't we been here before? Haven't people been alarmist about food in the past? And of course he's right. Thomas Malthus in the 1790s, Paul Ehrlich in the 1970s. And I take two lessons from this. The first is that if one is arguing for these things, one must argue them very rigorously and transparently. But I don't think it is a defensible argument to say because it's been wrong in the past, it will definitely be wrong in the future. In fact, it's almost dangerous to say that. and that for sure it might be wrong now, but the way to show it's wrong is to say exactly where there's a fault in the chain in logic, not to use the argument that because it's been wrong in the past. The second thing is, Sean spoke very eloquently about the importance of having viable rural farming communities, and I 100% agree with him on that. And I have no time to talk about the governance issues and things like that. I think we are in the rich world, in much of the rich world, especially in Europe, we're almost prisoners of an economic and institutional inertia of how we've produced food in the past, going back a long time. I have joint English and New Zealand citizenship. I have no English farming relatives at all. All my New Zealand relatives farm and things. And I'm not trying to pretend that what's happened in New Zealand is a model that one could apply to Europe. But I think there's a lot of lessons there. We put a massive amount of money into the rural community, other than the amount of money we pay from food. I think we get really appalling returns in public goods for the monies we put in there. I said that if I talked about biofuels, people in white coats would come and take me away. The same would happen with CAP reform. I think we're going backwards in CAP reform. It's a crying shame, because I want to get more money into the rural communities. I want to address Sean's really important point about volatility. The Foresight report had a whole section on volatility, which I didn't have time to talk about this evening. And I think we're timid and we are not radical enough about seeing how we could do that. Finally, I strongly agree with Sean about the difficulty of getting research, getting the pipeline really working from fundamental research all the way down to things that happen on the farm. I think we're all struggling to do that. I think a lot of applied research is applied in name only and will have no particular effect. We need to do that better. Frank made some really important points, and most of which I have nothing to disagree with, especially many of the things about the research. There's one thing I do disagree with that he said. There's little fear of intensification not being sustainable in Ireland and in Europe and things. I don't think you're being radical enough about what you mean by sustainable. For example, the greenhouse gases that come from out of ruminant productions are not only are they a major component of greenhouse gases, but we can do something about them. There's all sorts of interesting research going to that. Forgive me, I've forgotten his name. I had a fascinating conversation with someone who works on gut bacteria in humans. There are sorry? Paul Ross. I don't know if he's still here, but it was a really fascinating conversation. The last word we had was, what could one do in ruminants to reduce the amount of methane going out? So I think there are real challenges with intensification.
Okay, thanks very much, Charles. Now, we've loads and loads of tweets. There's a lot of activity in the Twitter sphere. Katrina Boyle is watching it for me down at the back, and I might call on her in a few moments to give us a summary. We're getting it up. Oh, good, excellent, yeah, because for some reason, I have to tell you, she's seeing tweets that I'm not seeing, and I'm seeing tweets that she's not seeing, so it was getting a little bit confusing. But if I may, first of all, before we go to the Twitter sphere, ask for comments from the floor. Does anyone have a comment to make? There's a gentleman there. Yes, please, yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much for your talk, and Teagasc.
I think if we could just hold on for a moment, we'll get a microphone to you. It's just out of courtesy to people at the back who may not hear you.
Okay. Firstly, thank you everybody for organising this, and Professor Godfrey. You've presented one view of food insecurity. There is another that lives in a tension with what you're describing here, and that is the potential for large-scale systemic shocks that would affect food security. Now, we may not realise it, but we were near a food security crisis 5 years ago if the financial crisis had imploded. And what this indicates is something very profound that, because it works, we effectively have habituated and ignored, is that increasing delocalization of our welfare, the complexity, the interdependence of things working in our economy, the speed of processes, be it financial or just in time in supermarkets, etc., has increased the risk or vulnerability to a major shock. And the most likely source of that shock is probably something in the global financial monetary system. And interestingly and worryingly, one of the vectors by which secular constraints on food or oil affect the global economy is through the financial system. And this is likely to be one of the major sources of a shock. We saw a glimpse of that in 2001 in Britain during the fuel blockades, and we've seen other indications. And that one of the things that we make our dependence increasingly precarious in one sense by increasing our technological integrationist dependence on a complex global economy is that if there is a shock, we have magnified our vulnerability. And that's the other angle. So I'd wonder if people could talk a little bit about that end of things.
Okay, interesting question. I mean, it's like the Rumsfeld question about known unknowns and unknown unknowns.
So a really fascinating question. We could, I suspect, debate it for hours. And I agree and disagree with you. So I agree with you that there are some global vulnerabilities. You mentioned delocalization, and I'm not sure if you were sort of arguing that we need to go back to more localized. Okay, so you weren't. Joe Stiglitz, the economist, who wrote in his book Globalization and Discontent, we're stuck with globalization, there's no way around it. The challenge is to make globalization work in favor of poor people, in favor of food security. We need the global grain baskets of Brazil and Ukraine to... So it surprised me when I first found out the country that imports more wheat than any other country in the world is Egypt. If the global food markets fail, then Egypt is in real trouble. But I completely agree with you. There are some stupid things we do that we should have the courage to change. Some of the high-frequency commodity trading, I think, is dangerous and is a risk that should be done. I think commodity trading has an enormous and very important value. I mean, futures markets were invented to reduce volatility. So I think that there are things that we can do, but and I'm glad you're not arguing that we need to go to a very different centre. We need to make globalisation work in favour. Okay,
I have a question down at the very back of the hall.
Yes, Leo, how are you? Damien O'Reilly from RTE. That was a very interesting first question in relation to food security. It was kind of part of what I was going to talk about, but just briefly, whenever we on our radio programme talk about this subject, or whenever you go to a conference in recent times, of course, intensive, or when we talk about how we're going to feed the world by 2050, 9 billion and all of that, it creates this kind of impression out there that, you know, there's not going to be enough food, and we always get this reaction from people to say, of course, we are producing enough food. It's not about being sustainable in producing the food, but being sustainable in the food we produce. So just would be interested in Professor Godfrey's view that there is that opinion out there that, you know, we're focusing too much on creating this scarce system, that we won't have enough food. We do have enough food, but it's about how we're more sustainable with the food that we produce.
Well, it's partly being more sustainable with the food we produce, but it's not a question of how much food we can produce. It's a question of the people having the money to buy it. And I think one of the things that's changed radically over the last 20 years is that now more than 50% of the global population lives in cities. And if you go to the Lagos of Dar es Salaam, these are massive, massive conurbations. 30 years ago, most poor people were rural. If there was a famine, they could buffer themselves to a certain extent from famine food. If they couldn't buffer themselves, they very, very sadly died invisibly. Now, with so many of the world's poorest in big global cities exposed to global food prices, if we get the global macroeconomics of food wrong, then Cairo starves and Lagos starves and things like that. So I should have said in my talk, I firmly believe we have to have a private sector that is working in favour of these macro food issues? I'm going to ask Sean on this because
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, Jamie. One of the things that we're increasingly seeing in more recent years, first of all, the concept of food security and the reality of it is something that large global brand owners are very, very conscious of. And I would say in the last 2 years in particular, some of the large ingredient buyers are very keen to have relationships with countries where there's a production environment that they see as favourable, in order to have long-term arrangements to address the very issue from food security. Now, they see it in their world as having security of ingredients, so that the product they produce and the brand that they have has security around it in itself. The other very interesting development, though, to the question, Damien, that you've asked, is the amount of emphasis that I would see in recent years on large companies, and indeed Glanbia would be very much in this space, looking at the concept of affordable nutrition, trying to identify ways where we can develop products that have a capability to be afforded in the very markets that Charles referred to, where individuals have low incomes and where income fluctuations have very significant capacities on their ability to purchase. So I think there's a huge emphasis internationally among large corporations now to look at how they can engineer product, bring science and innovation to the product to make it affordable to those population areas where the most significant growth in demand is and will be. Now, of course, with that becomes the challenge to ensure that the science is solid and sound, and that you can have affordable but nutritious products that are safe for the markets as well into which they go. So I think this is certainly an area where private enterprise, driven by an economic demand, is and will continue to focus into the future.
Okay, we'll get a microphone we'll come up to the front here. The gentleman at the front wants to say a word. But I'm going to just start a discussion. If you could hold on just for a moment. I'm not 100% sure what a sigh looks like on tweet. But Nash Pete says, interesting, Teagasc and Glanbia default to a productionist we can produce more approach with no reference to us all eating less. Gentlemen, defend yourselves.
Well, you'd hardly expect Glanbia to say eat less Glanbia product, Mr. Tweeter. Of course, we can eat less, and of course there can be less waste. But I would, if I take that approach from a Glanbia perspective, our focus actually is to produce more from less, to reduce our carbon, to reduce our energy, to reduce our waste in our plants, and this has always been our focus. And it's driven by not necessarily the motivation. It is the right thing, of course, to do, but the motivation is to ensure efficiency. So is it our job to save the world? Individually, of course, we'd like that to happen. As a corporation, we have to be concerned about the bottom line, about the profitability and growth of our organisation. So I doubt, although I know the tone of the question that was asked, I doubt if you'd expect anything different from an organisation whose purpose in life is to grow in return for our shareholders. But Frank, you may have a different view of life.
Not really, no. I think, for a country like Ireland, I think there is an economic gain, an economic imperative to actually produce more food. We can do it in a very sustainable manner here. We can do it probably more sustainable than most countries in the world, and we need it as part of for our own economic growth. And just in terms of the slight hint of criticism of us that we default into produce more, if you were to look at our research programme, it really is about resource use efficiency and how can we make more food basically from less resources. For two reasons. One, obviously for sustainability, but two, for profitability. And it is one of the great win-wins of this debate, that in general, anything that you do to improve sustainability also will improve production and profitability. So really, you're in most cases marching step by step the two of those. So I don't see any particular conflict or any particular reason to sort of say, well, no, we shouldn't. It's wrong to look to produce more food in Ireland. I think it's something we should and actually be proud of. We're a food producing country, and let's go with it. If I could just, while I have the microphone, get back in it at Charles there and his comment on my comment, I suppose, on sustainability within the EU. And I'm not really disagreeing with you. I do think we still need to obviously put a lot of effort into research to try to improve things like the greenhouse gas emissions from our agricultural systems, or the water quality from our agricultural systems, or whatever it might be, biodiversity. But, you mentioned greenhouse gases, and Europe has a cap set. We have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by either 20% or 30% by 2020. So, we have to do this food production in the context, that's the point I was making, in the context of a society that wants us to do it very sustainably. So, I think there are lots of checks and balances in the system for us here that will ensure we really stick to those goals.
Okay, Charles, did you want to say a brief word, if you wouldn't mind? I want to get back onto the floor.
Just a very brief word. I think we do have to be grown up, and you can't criticise the private sector for doing what the private sector does, which makes money, and we get many benefits from that, including cheap food. But conversations that I have with the private sector in the UK is that frequently they say, well, we're happy with regulation if it is genuinely a level playing field and if it's in place for a sufficiently long period of time that you can justify the investments in doing things. So I think there is sometimes timidity on behalf of the government in not doing things that actually won't cost the private sector money in the long run.
Okay, this gentleman here.
I'd like to say that as far as I understand it, our agriculture is already unsustainable. That it's a high carbon and high oil, essentially, input system that's not sustainable, given peak oil imminently or soon. And also, our most important ingredient, phosphate, which is a diminishing resource, depends on who you believe, it's only a 50-year, sometimes as low as a 50-year reserve. And I'd also like to...
Okay, very briefly now, because I want to go to the panel.
Throw out the other idea about less centralisation of food and more regionalisation. I'm just thinking in particular about the city of Hanoi in North Vietnam, which I read recently produces 80% of the food consumed by the inhabitants of the city within the city boundaries.
Sorry, Hanoi?
Hanoi, yeah.
All right. Okay, do you want to take that, Charles?
Yeah,
and if you could pass the microphone to Jerry there beside you. Thanks. Yep.
As I understand it, it's much less than that, although it's really interesting that Hanoi and some of the other big Southeast Asian countries do produce a lot of food within the city. It tends to be the high-value salads and things like that. It still needs a large amount of rice coming in from outside. I may have misunderstood your very first point, but I think that when it comes to carbon and things, 30% of greenhouse gases comes from agricultural systems, directly and indirectly, 50 directly. You made an interesting point about phosphate. So I think we are worrying too much about phosphate. The recent US Geological Survey has reassessed the reserves and is now talking about 400 years. If phosphate prices went up, I think one would have a blizzard of innovation of getting phosphorus from novel sources. There is a geopolitical issue in that phosphorus is concentrated in a limited number of countries.
Okay, I'll call on Professor Boyle, Jerry Boyle, who's the CEO of Teagasc.
Thanks. Just on the phosphate point, I think there was an interesting paper earlier today on the whole issue of the efficiency of phosphate use, which is another way of looking at it. I mean, and the same applies to the other nutrients. But just to make a comment, first of all, Leah, if you don't mind, I thought, Charles, your paper today was, I think, quite optimistic. I think that would be a fair assessment. It was very consistent, as Leo said, with the paper by Mensbrugge. And it was somewhat in contrast to John Beddington's paper. And maybe I was misreading Beddington's paper, but I came away a little bit feeling a bit more pessimistic, having listened to Beddington than I have been listening to you. But my question really it picks up on a point that both Frank and Sean made, and it's a real issue for us that we need to confront. My colleagues in Teagasc recently produced a marginal abatement cost curve for Irish agriculture. And at one level you would say it was they were quite optimistic conclusions, because we identified a whole slew of technologies that were consistent with sustainable intensification, which if the farmer adopted would actually have a negative cost in the sense that they would add to profit. And that raises a really difficult question as to why they don't adopt those technologies now. Or it raises the question, are the kind of technologies we expect farmers to adopt that are clearly consistent with sustainable intensification. Are we actually underestimating the costs, the actual transaction costs that are involved in adopting those technologies? And if I may give you a trivial example almost, I would think, for example, traditionally the advice of farmers to use chemical fertilizers is an intensification type strategy. But then now if you say to farmers, what we now want you to do is, we want you to do soil tests on a regular basis before you go out and purchase your fertilizers. We want you to take it another step perhaps and use precision farming technologies in purchasing and applying your fertilizers. Now, that's a totally different system we are requiring our farmers to engage in. I would suggest it's a much more complex task and more costly. And what worries me really is, because I think, and Frank would agree with me here, and I think Sean as well, we can identify those technologies that are, okay, some people will quibble, sustainably, consistent with sustainable intensification. But are we really getting at the core challenges in enabling farmers everywhere to adopt those technologies? Thank you.
Just a brief comment about John Bennington. John Bennington, when he was Chief Scientific Advisor, he commissioned the report. So I think we think fairly... After the report was published, then John and I did a double act for a whole number of things, where he did the doom and gloom, and then I did the optimistic bit. And every time we did it, I'd make a joke, and the next time we did it, he would steal my joke. So that by the end, he had this sort of stand-up act, and I was sort of just boring at the end and things. The substantive points you made about implementing sustainable intensification and various other things, I think are so important and really difficult. It goes back to some of the issues we were discussing earlier about how we structure agriculture in Europe. The dead hand of the past that makes it so hard for different actors to change. So certainly in the UK, it's very hard for the National Farmers Union to move, very hard for the environmental bodies, very hard for the political parties. So I think we have this inertia, this institutional inertia. I think that, as I think Sean said, this will only work if farmers are actually right at the core of what's happened. But the way we try and incentivize change, I think, takes a hugely naive view of the complexities of farming, and it treats farmers as sort of simple economic rational automata rather than the complexity. Farmers are proud of the farm; they're not simply profit maximization. And when I was calling for more research in the behavioural economics and the sort of social aspect of farming, if we don't understand that, we are never going to engender change. And I think if we don't get the institutional governance structures right, which I fear we haven't got right in Europe at the moment, then I do sort of switch from being an optimist to being a pessimist.
Okay, just for those who are planning for buses or trains or anything, we'll be finishing it at 8:15. So we have about 5 minutes, a little bit more, just about 5 minutes for discussion, and then Jim Flanagan from the RDS will be saying a few words. The gentleman down the middle has been waiting for ages to get in.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for letting me in. My name is Michael Hamel. I was Head of Agriculture for DG Environment in the European Commission for the past 15 years. And retired a few weeks back.
Oh dear.
So lots of the things that have been said here find resonance in my daily work. I think we have not mentioned the major challenge facing agriculture today. And the major challenge facing agriculture today is energy. Energy in terms of how are we going to live in the next 50 years when the oil runs out? That is the major challenge that we're going to face in agriculture. Why do I say that? I say that because if you go and you look at what the scientific community, the experts on geology and so on say, we've reached peak oil somewhere around 2005. Now, we have a few little new bits thrown in, shale gases, tar oils, a few bits and pieces like that. But basically, we're going to have to change our entire system of energy. I've looked at the economics of climate change. We did a lot of work with the UK government at the time. I've looked at the same thing on biodiversity. what's absolutely urgently needed, and I've asked ministers on many occasions, but I'll ask you to ask your minister, could we have the economics of future energy? Because you rightly said, be careful on biofuels, and it's not an emotional thing, it's just energy in, energy out, and the moral issue of what you do with the land. That's the real major problem. We have to find a new energy approach. And researchers in agriculture have to contribute to that, not just in the way of new crops, but in the way of how agriculture is organized. Let me make one or two other comments, because I'll be very brief.
Now, yeah.
Sustainable intensification. Look, to follow that in Netherlands and Belgium, which are very, very intensive, to improve water quality in both of those countries at the level that we're trying to do it, is going to take a minimum of 50 years to get to the standards at which the European Union 20 years ago made its lines. And on phosphate, I'd finish because we wrote a paper on it just a few months ago. I agree there's a great deal more phosphate around, at least according to the US satellites. But there is a question of how accurate those are, and we still need further information.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to take just a couple of final comments from the floor and then defer to Professor Godfrey just to respond. We've another question down there, comment down the back.
Trevor Dunn, an economist with Teagasc. I'm just wondering, following on from the excellent presentation, whether the debate has become a little bit muddled in the sense that we've been talking a lot about sustainability in the context of producing agricultural goods in a more, as I understand it at least, environmentally sustainable way. Yet, at the outset of the presentation, we talked about the importance of feeding the world and ensuring that we don't have a situation in the future where we have the levels of malnutrition we have at the present. Are those two objectives the same goal?
Okay, very good question. Very good question. And just there was one gentleman, the gentleman there in the red was offering, and I'm afraid I'll have to close it down then. He's been offering for some time.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on the definition of sustainability. Sean Malloy said sustainability of incomes, sustainability of returns. Then Frank was saying no problem in achieving sustainability. I don't know whether he really meant that or not. But I'm a bit concerned about this approach, because I think if that's your definition, I would sum it up in the phrase, having your cake and greening it. And because unless economic sustainability is based on environmental sustainability, it's not going to be sustainable. In my view, you have to start with environmental sustainability. And it's not going to be that easy to achieve the Food Harvest 2020 objectives in Ireland in view of our water quality and the risks to water quality. 30% of our rivers are at less than good status. And we're talking about increasing use of nutrients, obviously, to achieve the increased outputs. So unless we accept that there's a challenge there, my fear is that the farming community then won't make some of the changes that are needed. And it's not that I don't think that it can be achieved, because the research from Teagasc, for instance, is sufficient to allow us to come up with the means of achieving it. But if we don't accept that it will be challenging, my fear would be that we won't make the effort to achieve it. And just two last comments. What I would ask is that the Rural Development Programme could be used to help us in achieving both Food Harvest 2020 objectives and Water Framework Directive objectives, and that there be an improved advisory service, farm advisory service, which takes account both of farm production and the environmental aspects.
Okay, thanks very much. I thought that brought us right back neatly to the local level to finish off. I'll ask Professor Godfrey just to say a few words to finish, and then there will be an opportunity to chat with the panellists outside once we finish, but I'm keen to finish at about 8:15.
So, very briefly, bringing up energy right at the end for only a 10-second response is hugely challenging. Amazingly important and interesting topic there. I worry about the way biofuels have been used, that it hasn't been looked at properly and all the indirect effects have not been. I think that we are not yet at peak oil. I know that this is a hugely contentious area, but the research I see at the moment suggests that we may have a long way to go for peak oil. And I actually worry that when it comes to climate change, we may have too much oil, not too less. This begs the question of what one does in substitute. I'm a nuclear person myself. I think we have to do modern nuclear. There are a couple of issues about how sustainable intensification abuts the other major agendas in the food system. We wrote a piece on this, which I'm happy to pass on to people, and certainly our view is that it is worthwhile retaining the concept of sustainable intensification in the environmental context, so taking sustainability in its environmental, not its economic sense. But that in no sense says that the other agendas, the rural development, the rural viable livelihoods, nutrition, animal welfare, these other things, they have to be looked at simultaneously. And I think in doing that, it is helpful to have sustainable intensification as something different. And my final comment is I'm hugely grateful to the fascinating questions that you've thrown at me.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Charles. I hope that Damien O'Reilly of RTE Radio's Country Ride programme is suitably grateful for us filling, I would say, 4 programmes with all the issues that have been raised this evening.